Welcome to Multifamily EV Charging Made Easy. Actually, I think we even updated the title this time. I think it's actually Effortless EV Charging. It's all the same. We're here to help distill some of the nuances and things around EV charging at multifamily properties. So welcome to those who have just joined. We'd love to know who you are. So there's a chat on the right-hand side. It's the place for you to use for questions, but right off the top, before we kick this off and I pass it over to Thomas and Jeremy, let us know where you're coming from, where you're at, be it company or location, state, sense of being, whatever it may be. Let us know. Who's going to be the first on the chat to say hello? North Augusta, Ontario. Love it. Hey, Steve. Welcome to the conversation. Stephanie Greenwheel, located in New York. Wonderful. Thanks for being here. And Jeremy and Thomas can see them as well. So like, as you ask questions, they may see them, they may respond. This is to be a conversation. So like, if you have a thought or idea, just drop it in the chat. I will be on the chat after 30 seconds from now, and answering all these questions while I pass it over. So let's chat is basically it. Thomas, thanks so much for coming. New Jersey, great. And yeah, without further ado, let's kick this off. So I'm going to pass this over to Thomas and Jeremy, who are going to give you a great little overview. This is being recorded, so if anything you like and you're like, there's some cool stats and stuff like that on these slides, it'll be shared in email afterwards. But without further ado, I'm going to go off to the chat and pass it over to these two.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our Multifamily EV Charging Made Easy. I'm Jeremy Cohen, Director of Real Estate Partnerships here at Switch. It's really my role in the organization to work with developers and owners and operators of real estate to help them with their EV charging strategy. Every group is in different positions, and every group are seeing different things, and we want to make it as easy as possible for them to get going on this EV wave. Thomas.
Yeah, and I think one of the big challenges, especially with EV charging, is one, it's a new topic that a lot of people are actively looking to be experts on, and that all will depend on where you find yourself in the list of stakeholders in any given project. So our goal today is really to give you guys a sense of what is required at each step throughout the journey. We're going to allude at some of the tools we use for how to get the job done. And the real goal here is we want to arm the audience. We want to arm you with what questions should be asking at every stage along the way, whether it's in the planning stage, install stage, in the operation stage. So that's kind of the theme of today's webinar. And please put your questions in the chat, and Jeremy and I will get to them at the end, and hopefully we can add some color in areas that you're looking to learn a little bit more.
Great. So as Thomas alluded to, pretty much our agenda for this afternoon, we're going to talk about why EV charging now. There's a lot going on in the space. I'm sure everyone has seen the news, and really just kind of how we game plan around what's going on now in the EV charging space, and a lot of questions that Thomas and I typically hear on an average day. Thomas is going to take a deep dive into the hardware and the software, kind of what makes EV charging. And then we're going to kind of reiterate a couple times throughout the presentation what we call the path. And that is really the plan, the install, the manage, and the service of these EV chargers. So just a little bit about Switch. We have over 15,000 chargers out there on the Switch network right now, all across North America. A remarkable uptime of 97.5%. And we got started in the multifamily industry back in 2016. And since the industry has evolved and since Switch has evolved, we now really focus on what we call multi-tenant. And just below is just a great snapshot of these owners and operators that trust us with their EV charging at their assets across their portfolios. So what you'll see on a macro level in the thesis of today's webinar kind of goes around four main pillars. And what we like to call the end-to-end solution for multifamily properties. And as Thomas said at the beginning, everyone is on a different journey right now. So we want to take everyone who is with us right now across what our journey is and how we best believe to be deploying these chargers. So the first one is really the design portion of installation. Then we have the quoting process that includes the hardware and the software and any ancillaries that we might need to get these up and running. Then you have the installation process, which is working with qualified electrical contractors, electricians to physically do the installation of the chargers. And lastly, what Thomas will spend a lot of time talking about is the managing of these chargers as a whole. So a little bit of the summary of why EV charging now. So again, everyone's been seeing the news, you're reading the papers. It is projected that EV sales will be about 53% of all cars in 2030. So that is a big change from where we are at now. And the stat is that 80% of charging is happening at home. So whether that means you live in a single family home or a multifamily home, people want to charge where it's most convenient for them. And if you're in the multifamily space, this is an incredible time to get on board with EV charging because there are literally hundreds of active incentive and rebate programs out there to really incentivize deploying EV chargers. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in a bit. So what Thomas and I like to do, and you'll see this scattered throughout the presentation, are we wanted to share with you key questions that we typically get asked throughout the course of the day. I get asked a lot of questions from owners and operators of real estate. Thomas gets asked a lot of technical questions in what he does. So we wanted to make sure we kind of covered all of those bases because I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about these questions currently right now. So the first one would be, what type of chargers are available and what do you really need? There are a bunch out there, and Thomas is kind of going to walk you through right now what the different chargers are and what type you would probably best be fit for your certain scenario. Thomas.
Yeah, and this is a question that we like to lead off with just because it's a nice intro into the three levels of charging. And so generally there's level 1, level 2, and level 3 / DC fast. And level 1 is primarily going to be for those single family homes, places where you need to charge a little bit. You're in a pinch, whether you're at someone's house overnight, things like that. But level 1 is only going to give you about 1.5 kilowatts, and it's going to take a long time to charge the car. But if you're in that particular location for a long period of time, this does the job. Think of it more of like a small top up. But level 2 is by far the majority of the number of heads in the field today. And the reason for that is because it really strikes a node on both price point as well as charging speed. And so with the higher voltage, you can get a charge in 4 to 6 hours. And we really like to call this the overnight solution for anybody who is parking in a location where they're going to be spending the night, AKA multi-unit residential. And then finally, depending on the building, whether they might have shared commercial or multiple tenants, they might want to look into a level 3 or DC fast charger in limited numbers. But in cases here, we like to suggest them where you might have a transient audience that either might be coming to the building to stay, an hour, 2 hours. They want to charge their car quick and move on.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. So more questions that we typically get asked is, how many chargers should you install? And there's so many variables to this, which we're going to break down. So we know 53% of cars could potentially be EVs by 2030. And this is a great time to really engage your residents and tenants. So if you're an owner and operator, you want to take a look at the lot. Take a look at the lot, the garage, see how many EV cars there are right now. And if you don't have any chargers there, it's a great opportunity to say, well, where are they charging if they're not charging at my property? And how do I look to capture that, both from a tenant experience, but also from a potential revenue experience? It's also a great opportunity to create a survey monkey. Send it around to the tenants, the residents, and ask a couple questions. Say, hey, how many people have cars right now that are electric? Would you like chargers at the property? If we install chargers at the property, would you most likely buy a new EV vehicle? So it's just a great time to engage the community because you don't know what's going through their minds. You don't know their buying habits, but it's a great opportunity to position yourself to retain those tenants and residents as well, the more you engage them. The other question is, how many chargers can you install? which is a whole different conversation to begin with and really stems from your current electrical capacity at the building. We'll get into that a little bit more in a bit as well. The other topic of conversation, budget. Completely get it. Everyone is asking right now, how much do these things cost? And the truth is, you got to take a step back. And if you're an owner and operator of real estate, you can look at this in a couple of different buckets. So one is, how much available capital do you have on hand? It's a great conversation to say, here's what we have and here's what we can spend. A couple groups look at this also a little differently. Some want to put it in maybe as a marketing tactic and say, this is what separates building A from building B. Some are very concerned with the payback period needed, rightfully so. Some are looking at this as an OpEx versus CapEx. And there are available incentives and rebates that are out there to really mitigate some of that upfront capital outlay, which we will talk about in a little bit. And I saw some questions being asked already in the chat, so stay tuned. Thomas, over to you to talk about the system.
Yeah. Now, in order to effectively put our plan in place, we really need to understand what is the system capable of. And depending on the building and the solution, the system is going to be set up differently. But for someone dealing with multiple projects, it's important to understand the spectrum of what is available. The question that we get asked a lot is, can I just buy a normal level 2 charger, install them, and then start charging? And the answer is yes, you can, but only for a select amount of scenarios. And what will happen here is you will very soon find yourself in a position where you're limited based on some of the functions that these smart chargers can't enable. And the way I like to boil it down is into 4 key pillars: EV infrastructure, the software management, the driver experience, and the O&M. And so when thinking about the solution, you want to address each one of these pillars separately. And we refer to them as the 4 key pillars. And I think it makes sense if we start on the EV charger part, just because that's the physical device that you're seeing, as well as the infrastructure. And remember here, the goal of Jeremy and I's presentation is to allow you to ask the right questions throughout this journey, so that no matter what vendor you're working with, you're getting the right information that you can then make a decision on.
Nice, Thomas. So more questions that we typically get asked, and we hear this all the time. What should you be looking for when you do purchase a level 2 charger, since we are speaking to a big multifamily community right now?
Yeah, and the question of what hardware does what, or which model is best, comes up a lot. And no matter which vendor you're working with, they're all going to likely supply a different station. But what is the common thread throughout all of them that you want to pay attention to? And the standard that we recommend, and at this point it's the majority of the industry, is the Open Charge Point Protocol, OCPP for short. And the idea here is that the charging stations that are working with OCPP speak the same language and can work on different networks. And what this does is it de-risks and future-proofs the installation, allowing the property to have freedom of choice around the network that they select. And so the scenario that we're trying to avoid is, if you choose a particular piece of hardware, you don't want to be locked into that solution long-term, because if you're unhappy with the service or reliability, you would physically have to rip that station out and install new ones, which can get very expensive. And so whether it's a charger from some of the bigger names like ABB, Siemens, LG, or one of the European brands, OCPP is that through line that'll be consistent with all, and that's what you're going to want to look for. When it comes to the hardware itself, they come in all different shapes and sizes. We've worked with virtually everybody in the market at this point, and our goal here is basically provide a recommendation for what we think fits best for the given application.
Nice, Thomas. So you walked us through a little bit about the hardware options, the OCPP, readiness. What are other considerations if you're an owner and operator of real estate that should be considered outside of just the chargers themselves?
Yeah, we're going to want to look at the chargers, which we've just talked about. Some accessories usually come into play if you're talking outdoor lots, like the photo on screen here. Outdoor can get a little tricky because, as you can see, you need bollards and pedestals, and it can get a little clunky. So the conversation tends to revolve around where do we put them with the given accessories. We also want to talk electrical. My team specifically at Switch, we do a lot of the electrical design for these systems. And our job is to educate our partners and customers on what the system is capable of in terms of energy management. I'm going to get into what that means in a second. You're also going to want to think about, okay, I have these devices in the garage and they have energy meters inside of them. How do I provide internet connection to them so that we can read how much every driver is charging and bill them for the respective kilowatt hour consumption so that the building is made whole at the end of the day for energy consumption? And then finally, the software. The software is what manages and enables all of this good functionality. The idea or the question around the software is we want to set this up so it's virtually hands-free for the majority of the year, and it's something that you check in on, annually or biannually to make sure that the EV driver's behavior matches the intention of how you set up those stations. And we can dive into that very shortly. So that summarizes kind of EV charging and infrastructure. And, Jeremy and I could definitely fill up a whole hour just on infrastructure alone. If you are interested, we can take the conversation offline and explain some of our design decisions in a separate conversation. But I wanted to talk now about the software. And so the question that we get asked a lot is, okay, these EV chargers, do I need software to manage them when really they're just really big electrical outlets? And the answer is yes, because throughout the journey of operating those stations, likely in the first year, you're going to be asked, who can access these chargers? How much revenue are they going to generate? How does the driver pay for electricity? What if all of the chargers turn on at the same time? If the driver leaves their car at the EV charging port, what happens? Can we kick them out? And how do I know if something breaks? And so without considering software, these are all questions that you're going to likely run into very shortly. And so the cornerstone here is a management platform. And at Switch, we've got Switch OS, which I just explained is designed to set up the stations to force the drivers and the vehicles into the desired behavior that suits the building. And so this could mean a number of things. It could mean access control, private, shared, public. It could mean various charging rates based on time of use rates from the utility. The rates can be based on how much energy the building is actively consuming. So if the building's on peak, maybe we charge a higher rate. We can do loitering and enforcement. So for shared spaces, if people are leaving their cars there after they're finished, we can potentially charge them a loitering penalty to incentivize them to free up that asset for another driver. And then finally, Switch OS is where you collect all of the data so that semi-annually you can review this and guarantee that the behavior is what you intended out of the parking spots.
Nice, Thomas. So one of the biggest questions that I get asked, and we hear this all the time, and I'm sure some of you are thinking about it, was the electricity and the building's electricity in particular. So we are not naive. There are so many old buildings out there. There's just so much old building stock, right? Maybe you have class B and C properties and you say chargers were not meant to go in here. No one was thinking about EV charging 5 years ago, yet alone 50 years ago, if one of your buildings is that old. And you don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new infrastructure just to even retrofit it. We completely understand that. And then it becomes, how many chargers can you install if that is the case? If you are electrically constrained, maybe your building is really old, maybe your panel is almost already maxed out, and now you're going to throw EV chargers into the mix. How do you look at that holistically, right? You don't want to pay for the infrastructure and you don't want to pay for the upgrades. How do you do it?
Yeah, and this is exactly why we included this textbook example slide that we like to show to communicate the concept of what happens if you continue to add EV chargers to the building without managing how they charge, how much power they consume, and when does this happen? And so in this simple figure, you can see that for a multi-unit residential building, the building likely is going to experience the peak during the evening hours when the tenants return to building, cook dinner, turn on the TV, turn on the air conditioning and heating. And so if we're also plugging in vehicles at the same time, it's only going to add to this peak. And so I've got a nice little animation here to summarize this concept of how we can control this. So one by one, if we continue to add EV chargers to the building, we're very soon going to exceed the limit that it was designed for, whether it's the distribution gear, whether it's a specific sub panel. And the idea is that we don't want charging to coincide with these peaks, putting stress on the electrical system in the building. And so with the use of load management, what we can do is take that charging and shift it to the times when capacity is available to us in the building, whether it's off-peak hours, in the evening, or in the morning. But the design criteria is that we want to make sure that every vehicle is full by 6 a.m. so that every driver starts the morning at 100%. And so another reason why software is important is to control when and how charging happens from an electrical point of view. And so this brings us now to the EV driver experience. I just mentioned that we want to set our design criteria such that we keep the EV drivers happy while not breaking the bank. So let's talk about what that experience looks like. Essentially, a driver needs the 3 following key functions out of a software platform or out of an EV charger. They need to be able to use it, charge their vehicle. They need to be able to pay for the energy that they consume. And then in the event there's any issues technically, they need to be able to get help. And so at Switch, we have just the solution for that. We have our mobile app, which allows drivers to interface with the charger, pay, keep records, get receipts, the usual. And they can also access this on the go through a web app if they don't want to download it and create an account. And they can also use an RFID card. So if you have a station in your building that you frequent, no need to pull out your phone. You can request an RFID card that's either a card or a keychain. You simply tap it on the machine. We know it's you. Your car is authorized to start charging.
One of the biggest questions we hear time and time again from ownership groups is, how do EV drivers pay for the electricity used?
Exactly. And so there's a number of ways to do this, but most hardware on the market at this point has revenue grade meters inside of the charging station. And so the need for sub meters on every circuit is no longer a hardware requirement because it's now a built-in feature of most units. And so what will happen is every time a driver plugs into an EV charger, we know who that driver is, and we will bill them for the amount of energy they consume during that transaction. Switch will collect that money from all the drivers. We will put it into a virtual bank account, and then we will be depositing it back to the building, to their shared facilities account, or however it's set up, to basically make them whole for the energy consumed by the tenants out of the shared elements in the parking garage. And so the idea here is that the building is netting zero from an electrical cost standpoint, and this is happening on a monthly basis.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add the O&M. It's one of the biggest parts, that we get asked all the time. Or you have so much going on. You have the chargers, you have billing, you have remittance, you have the software. What happens if something breaks?
Exactly. And if you look up EV charging in the news, most of the articles are around reliability and poor experiences, whether it's in the public network or the private network. And so at Switch, most of our customers are in the private multifamily context, and they need reliable access to charging. And so in our world, reliability is everything. And we have a plan in place to make sure that we guarantee that experience at the driver level. And so what this looks like is a charger uptime of 97.5% and a network uptime of 99.7%. This is very high. It's also a very hard thing to do. And so we're very outspoken on how we're able to achieve these numbers. But basically, Switch has a 24/7, 365 monitoring service that we basically can detect issues in the field before a driver interacts with that station. And the idea is that if we can catch these issues before a driver, it's one less unsatisfied driver that will potentially leave a bad review or, for that matter, not come back to that location. And so what we're able to do is diagnose problems remotely. And in most cases, we are able to reset the station and fix it, potentially relieving someone having to be bothered by either plugging into a new station if it's broken or submitting a support ticket. But the idea here is that Switch in the operating system is taking care of this for the property so that we're the first line of defense, and the property management or the building is not getting called every time someone has trouble charging their vehicle. Oh, Jeremy, you there? You're on mute. Your mic might have changed. I can take this one. So we've talked about the plan in the system. So now how do we put this into action? So the idea here is that when combining all these steps, we're going to want to think about each one of those 4 pillars that we talked about to make a plan that sets the building up for success long-term. And so on the plan side, we talked about accessing the demand, surveying the residents, access to electricity coming in. We can do a full electrical assessment and provide recommendations to whether it's the engineer or the electrician. We can talk system preferences. But more importantly, we need to understand, are there incentives and credits that could influence our design? Because some of these incentives and credits are actually allowing buildings to future-proof for that 2030, 2035 vision, where you've got 50% of vehicles in the parking garage being electric. And so what we have here, Jeremy mentioned earlier on that there's currently 284 active incentive plans opened in the US and Canada. And the idea is that we're there to provide the expertise on how to get this funding. I saw a question in the chat. We do help with the incentives in the New York area. And so we're happy to help there. But whether it's the municipal, state, provincial, or utility level focus, we've got the expertise. We have a bids and RFP team internally who are the experts on getting these grants, and we're there to make it easy on you. But if you're in a location that doesn't have an active incentive or grant, there's also a 30C tax credit available. And so I took a screenshot of the map. They have a little tool online with the US Department of Energy. As you can see, it can get very complicated, but you can receive up to 30% of a $100,000 project back. And the idea here is that our team internally at Switch can help you navigate this somewhat complicated process and make it easy on you. And so the idea here being that if we know we can get access to incentives, it will influence our design.
Can you hear me, Thomas?
We got you now.
Wow, sorry, I don't know what happened over there. Thanks for taking over.
All good.
So picking up a little bit where Thomas left off was, it's very important to work with a contractor who has EV charging experience. There's so many electricians out there. They say they can do it, but until you've been boots on the ground and have done one of these projects, it's absolutely vital. And again, planning for today, because tomorrow will be totally different. And going back to what Thomas was saying about some of the incentive programs, take the money now because the well will run dry. So the time is now, because these incentive and rebate programs will not last. When you're managing, back to what I was saying earlier, engage the community, engage the residents. You don't have to go at this alone. A lot of times they want to be heard and seen, and it's just a great opportunity to see, again, how many EV cars there are in the lot, who's most likely to use them. If you install them, will you see an uptick in demand and usage? And a lot of what Thomas had spoken about earlier is that software is so key. You have full visibility into these chargers, what asset they're assigned to across the whole portfolio. You can really wrap your arms around it. And service, of course, what Thomas mentioned earlier as well, that ongoing O&M. So a lot of these level 2 chargers that are going into multifamily settings, they come with either a 2 or a 3-year standard warranty.
Oh, Jeremy, your mic cut out there again, but I can finish that point for you. Warranty options, it's standard on most products, but you do have the availability to purchase extended, and then ongoing care, kind of the white glove service. So for properties that may not have an office locally, that may not have the ability to check in on these stations day to day, we've got a complete O&M package that will basically make it white glove. We fix the issue, we pay for it, labor included. I've been seeing a lot of questions in the chat, so I think it's appropriate now that we can dive into some questions and hopefully get a little bit deeper on what some of those interests are.
Thanks. And Tom, way to roll with that. I feel like this is like some sort of training for some live broadcast gig of yours coming up. Thanks so much for that. It was a great overview. Some questions. I've got some direct ones that people sent me and some in the chat. Last one out is Jenna said, do you need Wi-Fi in the garage to use the system?
Yeah. Wi-Fi in the garage isn't a requirement for the building to provide. We actually provide it ourselves. And then in some cases, we do open that up to the tenants if there's no cell service. In a garage that people frequent, we actually see most people using the RFID cards just out of ease of access. But to answer your question, that's something we provide and we operate ourselves so that if anything goes wrong, we will be fixing it.
That's great. Going back in the line to the plan stage, someone asked about contractors. We have a contractor for our property. Is it recommended that we use them to do the install or one of your contractors?
It's the choice of the property. What we would recommend if they did want to proceed with the local contractor is we can maybe hop on a call and we can give them a quick summary of everything they need to know technically from our system. And so the idea here is that if the contractor knows the building and they're trusted, let's use them. You already have an existing relationship, and the Switch team is more than happy to train them on everything they need to know to assess your building and provide a project scope that makes sense.
Great. And we'll go back to the chat on this one. So I'll ask, what multifamily incentives are you showing in the District of Columbia?
I can go back to that.
Yeah, and so what Thomas is showing here is that is a screenshot from a service that we subscribe to, and we have access to essentially look at all the types of incentives, both municipal, state level, federal, or provincial, if you're a Canadian. And that's something that I'm going to answer the question for you. If you want to know the details of your location and what's eligible, be that and or for the federal tax credit, the 30%, you can reach out to Jeremy or Thomas, and they can easily show you that, walk you through it, and give you that answer pretty quickly. And we've got team members all across the country who could also dive into those local details, so you know exactly what you're walking into on the incentive side. Great question, Al. Great answer, Greg. Paul. Hello, any thoughts on networked L2 versus smart panel type systems? Pros, cons, user experience. Great question. Thomas, you want to?
Yeah, we typically like to recommend a solution that leaves the property open to options long-term. And what I mean by that is the solution that they're purchasing is not unique to a specific vendor, meaning that they have the freedom of choice. The analogy that we like to use is moving a cell phone from Verizon to AT&T. If you buy an iPhone, you can pick your cell phone provider and go back and forth depending on the coverage in your area and depending on the service. So that's kind of our key point there. When it comes to the hardware itself, they all do a very similar job in terms of charging the car. And so we like to think on a more of a purchasing decision rather than just hardware features themselves. As long as the car is getting full by 6 a.m., then it's doing the job.
So to clarify, but he's asking about, so which do you consider to be that interoperable cell phone model, the networked L2 versus smart panels? Just want to make sure.
Yeah. So we would consider the networked L2 option because the network is decoupled from the hardware provider.
Whereas smart panels?
It's with a physical piece of hardware that's operating that device.
Right. Yeah. Great answer. Great. Thanks for that. Stephanie, who completes the incentive paperwork? You mentioned being able to help with that process, but who actually submits all the paperwork? Great question. Jeremy?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can. Welcome.
I don't know what's been going on. Stephanie, to answer your question, one, I live in New York, happy to help in any way, but a lot of times the groups that we are most familiar with doing a lot of the work in New York, these electricians, electrical contractors, would be the ones handling the incentive paperwork because they're dealing with the utility companies. So if you're looking for trusted partners in the area, happy to chat. They take care of a lot of the heavy lift.
The question was earlier was sent directly was about the software system. So for the Switch software system, is there a guide or like, do we have to train people on the system itself once we use it?
Yeah. So if the building does want to move forward with Switch, we have a team that trains the property on how to set it up accurately, and they'll basically explain everything you need to know of, what rates you can set or what's appropriate, what are the industry standards, and we'll basically train the building to a point that they can operate it autonomously on their own. And then Switch acts as kind of a resource if they have any questions on the ongoing basis. So yes, the answer is yeah, we have resources there to help you.
Great. And then another that was sent off the top is, can Switch run multiple use case installations? So let's say 6 install indoors and then 2 visitor install outdoors. Can some be private? Can some be shared or like available to the public?
Yeah, everything can be configured on the individual charger level. So you can have 2 charging stations beside each other configured completely differently, price, access, etc. And so the answer is yes, it's done on the charger level, not the location.
Great. And then what does maintenance look like for these chargers or chargers in general?
Generally, the cable is the only real moving part. So as long as the building's taking care of the installation, making sure that people return the port back to the holster after they're done charging, we don't really see much physical maintenance coming out of these charging stations. Switch does do routine software maintenance on the chargers. And what I mean by this is anytime the manufacturer comes out with a better firmware for that unit, we'll be proactively upgrading it in the background, just so that the station's using the latest, greatest software output by the manufacturer. Think of it like the operating on your cell phone. Every year or two, they come out with a new version that's a bit cleaner and quicker. Same applies here. And that responsibility is on Switch. And we do this behind the scenes.
Another one that I got was, there are lots of types of level 2 hardware. How do you know which one is best for my property?
There's a long list of hardware. Our general approach here is providing you with some of the results that we have in the field. We've got thousands of deployed, as Jeremy mentioned. We've got 15,000 to create a sample size, and we can tell you what the reliability is of certain units. And that's generally our approach, because we don't want to take sides with a specific manufacturer. We just want to show the results that we're seeing, which back up our confidence in a specific model.
Awesome. Those are the last questions that I were sent. People in the chat that you're here with us, this is your time. What questions do you still have that are burning that you want to get answered and pick these guys' brains? My other thought is to you, Jeremy and Thomas. Any particular last thoughts or feelings? Before any of those, while you're thinking about your question, this is being recorded. This will be sent out to everybody who's here registered, so you can watch the recording. And I'll also include both Jeremy and Thomas's contact information. You can find them on LinkedIn as well. If you have any specific questions or want to find some time to figure out incentives or what's available, now I'm going to pause to see, Jeremy, Tom, do you have any last parting words for everyone on takeaways? Thomas, go for it.
Sure. I saw some emails on the attendees on the engineering side. There's a lot to unpack on the electrical design aspect, and that's my specialty. And so if you want to talk how to set things up electrically, I'm your guy. Whether it's distribution gear, wiring, panel sizing, transformer sizing, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. So happy to answer any of those questions if you want to take anything offline.
Awesome. Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll say on the real estate side, if you're an owner and operator and you've never done this before, a lot of times the groups start to look at the portfolio holistically, and that's great. and everything, but don't get so worried. Start with one property, identify the property in which has the most lucrative incentives, and start there. And then you can start to scale throughout the portfolio. And again, don't rule out any asset class, A, B, C. It's happening across the board. And don't feel like you need to go out alone. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes. And we're just so fortunate for all the subject matter experts that really just make this happen. So if you're thinking about it, if you want to dip your toe in the pond, reach out. We can look at it holistically, and then we can start to attack strategically.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Thomas, Jeremy, thank you so much for taking the time. And everybody here, thanks so much for taking the moment to reflect and learn a little bit about EV charging. Hopefully you got something. And as I said, you'll get an email from us with this recording and contact information for any questions you guys have. Have a fantastic rest of the day. And yeah, see you online. Bye, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.